Allison, how are you?
Hi, Annabella. I'm great. It's nice to talk to you. How are you?
It's nice to talk to you too. I'm Annabella Pitkin from Lehigh University Religion Studies Department, and my conversation partner today is Dr. Alyson Prude, an assistant professor in religion studies at Georgia Southern University. And we are talking today about a practice that I suspect is unfamiliar yet very intriguing to many of the listeners. The practice is called delog practice, and it is a feature of Tibetan and Himalayan Buddhism in which, to sum it up in a few quick sentences, women in particular, and sometimes men, experience a terrible illness, die, and then return from the dead with reports about the realms that exist after death. Is that a good way to describe delog practice, or is there more to it than that?
That's a really good basic description. And if we really want to get into it, there is more to it than that, but there's also sometimes less to it than that. And so figuring out what a delog is and how this practice works was a very interesting and challenging piece of this project. But if we start with the outline that you suggested, which is that a delog is someone who becomes ill, dies, and then returns from the dead bringing messages. The crucial piece of that is returning from death with messages. And as you know, but our listeners might not, the term delog means returned from the dead. So whether or not a person experiences an illness beforehand is not as important. Some delog do report being ill before their delog experience, but for others the death is sudden and unexpected. And this is where things get complicated. There's some people known as delog who, from our perspective, have not died, have not gone through the physiological process of bodily death, but they have experienced what Tibetans call the bardo. And bardo means in between, and it refers to the states of existence between one life and the next. We could call this the afterlife. And there are a significant number of meditative adepts in Tibet who go into meditation, and while they're in meditation, they might have a visionary experience of the bardo. They visit the body through meditation, and then they come back with reports of the dead, and these meditators are sometimes called delog. But this was not the focus of my research. I focused on people who are said to have undergone a really bodily, physical death. And this focus kept my questions exoteric, such that I could discuss them with people who had no formal education, no Buddhist training. And so that's kind of the less part of my answer to your question. We don't necessarily have to be ill, and whether or not you physically die seems like it's flexible. But what is always part of delog accounts is that you have to come back with messages from the dead.
Wow. Now, do people come back with messages from people that they knew, from family members or community members?
They do. They'll come back with descriptions of particular individuals, both that they knew and that they didn't know. They can come back and say, I met this person named such and such who says he's from this village and his family members are named blah, blah, blah. And people will go and check and see, does someone live in a village with this name, and does this work out with their family? And that's one way of kind of verifying what the delog we're talking about and deciding if they're real or not. But this function of bringing messages back is what Tibetan Buddhists value about delog. And so when someone dies, say it's a family member, you can go to the delog and say, how is this person doing? How are they faring in the afterlife? And the delog can tell you.
Wow, I can see why that would be a really compelling promise of this practice. Now, there's several things that you just mentioned that I'd like to follow up on, but before we do, maybe you can just fill us in a little bit on some of the background. Where did you do this research? Where do delog live? Is everyone who's a delog Tibetan? Tell us a little more about that context.
Well, I had anticipated doing all of my research in a community in eastern Tibet. the part of the Kham region that's outside of the TAR, outside the Tibetan Autonomous Region. But several things happened, and I wasn't able to do that. And instead, I ended up spending time in Nepal. And when I was in Nepal, completely to my surprise, I found that there's a vibrant delog tradition among the Tamang and Yolmo people of Halambu. And so I hadn't expected that, but then I did some research there as well. And afterwards, I ended up in Amdo in northeastern Tibet and found that there's a really strong delog tradition there as well. So it seems that this delog practice stretches all the way down eastern Tibet from Amdo into Kham. It's also in Bhutan and in Tibetan Buddhist parts of Nepal.
Wow, that's incredible. So it's all across the Tibetan world, because I certainly have heard a lot of stories of Daeluk in central Tibet too. So it sounds like the whole Himalayan region has people with these experiences.
It seems that way.
Now, do people in any other societies become Daeluk? Are there American Daeluk or French Daeluk?
That's a great question and one that I hope to explore in the future. It seems that the answer is yes, in the sense that there are reports of people in Thailand, for example, who fall unconscious, find themselves touring the lands of the dead, then they revive with very specific and detailed information about historical individuals that they met while they were traveling through the realms of the dead. Would Tibetan speakers use the word Delok to describe people outside their culture? And that depends on the person. Occasionally I would describe like a Western style near-death experience to a Daylok and say, someone was in the operating room, they're on the table, they die for a couple of minutes or maybe just a few seconds, and they come back and say they saw a white light, blah, blah, blah. And some Tibetans would consider that a Daylok. They'd say, yes, that person died and came back to life, so that's a Daylok. But others didn't. Others said to be a Daylok that a person has to revive with stories that support a Buddhist cosmology. The Buddhist cosmology that Daylok practice both relies on and verifies.
Now that sounds very important. The idea that Daeluk practice relies on Buddhist cosmology and also is a way to kind of verify that that cosmology is true. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Sure, and that gets into the way that Daylok are legitimated. I mean, on the one hand, this is a practice that it's something that just happens to someone outside of any formal religious training, outside of monasteries. But at the same time, the reports that you have to give in order to be legitimated, recognized as a Daylok, have to line up with standard Buddhist doctrines and teachings.
And what kind of experiences do Daeluk describe? What do they say happens to them?
Well, this is interesting because there's a significant difference between what texts about Daylok describe and what the Daylok that I met like to talk about. So textual accounts of Daylok often describe the process of dying, the sensations and the visions that people experience as our bodies shut down. But none of the Daylok that I met mentioned this. When I asked, they had nothing to say about it. But the experiences that they described all took place after the dying process had been completed. And it was stories of particular punishments tied to particular negative actions. For example, there was a Daylok in Nepal who told me that people who eat chicken experience an afterlife in which chicken peck the flesh from their legs. And a Daylok in Tibet,
Wow.
she cried as she described this tree of razor blades, and this tree is surrounded by women who have had abortions. And so at the top of this tree, she said, are the voices of small children. They call out to these women, and the women try to climb the tree to get to the children, but the tree is made of razor blades. And so the women's bodies are torn to shreds and they fall down, and then their bodies come back together again, and then again they're trying to climb the tree.
Wow. So there's a real kind of ethical charge to this description of the afterlife, where it's very much connected to talking about what kinds of actions are negative or what the consequences of certain actions are. It's very interesting to see how these after-death forms of suffering are a kind of commentary on lives people are leading in the present.
Yes, precisely.
Now, a lot of these experiences sound really frightening. Did the people, the delog that you met and spoke with, did they describe these experiences as being scary?
You know, they really didn't. They would describe what they call it going daylok. So they would describe going daylok as difficult, as physically and emotionally exhausting, as bothersome. But they didn't describe it as frightening. Maybe this is because Buddhist accounts of the bardo and of the hot and cold hells are fairly graphic. So witnessing torture and pain are not a surprise. A tree of razors, for example, is a common element in Buddhist accounts of the hell realms. But for whatever reason, no, they didn't describe it as particularly scary.
I'm interested by this verb, by the idea that it's kind of hard work rather than being scary, and also by this verb to do delok. It makes me want to ask you whether this is an intentional practice that people do things to cultivate, or whether this is something that happens to you, that kind of seizes you, whether you want to or not.
It's, well, again, there you can find texts that describe meditative adepts who can kind of control it and undergo a Daylok experience of their own volition. But generally, and among the people that I met, it was not something that they could control. It was going to happen to them whether they liked it or not, and there was nothing that they could do about it.
Have anyone that you spoke to who currently does delok practice now, have any of those people tried not to be delok, not to have this experience?
You know, they didn't mention that, but because the sense was that there was nothing that they could do. Like they were commanded, in one case, a woman in Nepal said that the Lord of Death, who is kind of hanging out and controlling this afterlife, this place that we're calling the Bardo, that he told her, you have to do this, you have to come and do this thing. And so, she was under his control.
That's so interesting. Now, when people who do delok come back to the realm of the living and to their communities and families, how do people there respond? How do their family and communities react to them?
Well, in terms of families, the answer is usually not very well. It's a bit of a crazy thing to tell someone that you toured the afterlife and you interacted with the dead. And in Tibet, under the policies of the Chinese state, these sort of claims can get you into trouble with the government. But even in Nepal, where there are no government regulations against these kinds of practices, no one ever wants to hear from a Daylok, or from anyone for that matter, that members of their family committed crimes or immoral actions. So when a Daylok revives and starts naming names and accusing dead individuals of having stolen or cheated or not had sufficient faith in the Buddhist three jewels, people get really, really unhappy. And so a family's first reaction to a Daylok often is to make him or her stop talking. Just stop telling these stories, shut up, because they do not reflect well on deceased members of the community. One Daylok told me that her family stuffed rags in her mouth and then they tied her up in a burlap bag in order to keep her from talking. And I heard a story about a male Daylok whose uncle beat him with shoes in an attempt to make him stop. He beat him until he fell unconscious.
Wow.
And so these stories of abuse are dramatic, but they have little effect on the Daylok, because the Daylok claim not only that they can't control this experience, but they also can't stop themselves from speaking. Except in the case of the man who was beaten with shoes. His uncle finally beat him to the point of death, and so he died. But, in order to kind of keep the reputation of the community and to protect the family from both outsiders becoming angry and from government stepping in, family will try and stop the Daylok.
That's so interesting because it's such a compelling kind of information, and you would think that on some level that people would want it very badly. And on the other hand, there's this, you're talking about this kind of pressure to be silent. That's a very interesting tension, that there's this seductive kind of potential knowledge of the afterlife and the fate of the dead, including the beloved dead. And then there's this kind of pressure because of shame to restrict that information. It's a very interesting communal tension.
Right? If it was all good reports, I think people would be much more excited about delog. But when you tell a person of power that, you know, his father did something wrong, he's going to come back at you.
Hmm. That being the case, what can we say about why Daylok bring these negative reports, and why they experience this compulsion to share them, that they sort of can't stop talking? Is there some kind of ethical dimension to Daylok practice?
Um, well, there's an ethical dimension in the sense that the delog's reports reinforce normative Buddhist morals, right? Especially ethical injunctions against killing. And I'd say that punishments for having killed animals are the most common ripening of negative karma that Delog describe. And so I mentioned what a Nepali Delog said about people who eat chicken and what's going to happen. Delog in Tibet talked about, you know, nomads who killed their yak, or people who hunted wild game. In one case, a woman who had accidentally killed a cat. The cat had hopped up on a shelf where the woman kept her cooking oil and knocked the jar off the shelf, you know, spilling the oil, which was expensive, and the woman got angry. She hit the cat died. And so, in that sense, there's definitely an ethical dimension to this. You know, why Delok feel compelled? Well, it's the way they describe it, it's not something that's even under their control. But as they revive and as their senses kind of come back to them, um, their mouths are talking, you know, independently of, you know, what the Delok themselves are aware of. And so sometimes they claim, once they've completely kind of come to, that they don't even remember what they said, that they have no idea what these reports are. And so they'll say, oh, but so and so says that I said blah, 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 but I myself don't remember.
That's so interesting. The element of the involuntary versus the voluntary. I noticed that a lot of the qualities of Daylok practice that you describe resonate with other kinds of practices in the Tibetan Buddhist world. For example, people who act as oracles, who experience the descent of a deity and then become a kind of mouthpiece for that deity's information about health or about the future or about the well-being of the community. And the way in which that is also somewhat involuntary, that people become ill and then they become open to these experiences and they can't contain them, even if some of the information they bring is unwelcome to the bystanders.
Right, absolutely. I think there are definitely parallels. And when I would speak to some people about Daylog, if they didn't have, you know, experiences that they could share, stories that they had heard, and maybe they had never heard of Daylog before, a lot of times they would fill in with stories of spirit possession, of someone being possessed, say, by a spirit of someone who had just died. And so that was an association that Tibetans also made.
It's very interesting. Another thing that I notice is that many of the Daylok that you talk about and that others have written about, and also some of the famous Daylok of Tibetan literature and Tibetan opera, tend to be female. Although they're not all female, many of the most famous ones are female. And I wonder if there's something gendered about Daylok practice, or if any of the people you spoke with described a reason why women might be more likely to have these experiences.
Yeah, this was a big part of what I wanted to figure out, and it was something that I asked people often. But it was a tough question to get answers to. So people were generally quick to confirm that there is a gendered aspect to Daylok practice, but it wasn't something that they had tried to explain before the Americans showed up asking all these questions. But basically, the reasons people suggested for most Daylok being women fall into two categories, and one relates to stereotypes about women's personalities, and the other has to do with tantric theories about male and female bodies. So let me start with the latter. And this goes back to Indian tantric sources, about which I am far from an expert. But the idea is that in addition to our physical bodies of gross matter, we have, for lack of a better term, something like energy bodies. And so yogic practices allow us to manipulate our energy, to control its circulation, and through that to attain liberation. But it's said that the channels in a woman's energetic body, the pathways through which this energy flows, are more open. They're less constricted than the channels in a man's energetic body. And so how does this relate to delog? Well, according to a tantric understanding, when we die, our consciousness leaves our body through these channels, through an opening in these channels. And so the delog's consciousness, goes out of her body, she goes to the bardo, this afterlife stage, she has the experiences there, and then for whatever reason, instead of moving on to another birth, the consciousness reverses its course and it re-enters the body that it just left. And so because women have these more open channels, it's easier for the consciousness to get back in. For men, on the other hand, because their pathways are more narrow, it's harder for the consciousness to kind of get back in the body. But that's a fairly esoteric explanation that I didn't hear very often. More commonly, people commented that women are more ethical. Women have better karma, which is to say that they create better karma in their lives when they are women than men do. And so if you pair that with this belief that only people with really good karma are going to be sent back to life as messengers, then you get the expectation that women are going to return to life more frequently than men. And then finally, and related to this, is a stereotype that relaying messages is a feminine task. And so since delog are mainly messengers, then people expect them to mostly be women.
That's really fascinating, and I'm really intrigued by the idea that although delog often relay messages about the negative karmic consequences of bad things that people who are deceased have done, they themselves are understood as people with very good karma. That's very intriguing, and so is the idea that women tend to accumulate better karma in their lives as women than men do. Those are both maybe aspects of Tibetan Buddhist views on karma that we're less familiar with. Now, one follow-up question that I wanted to ask you about the question of gender and women who are delog. I'm just thinking about the most famous, or one of the most famous delog in Tibetan literature. The Tibetan opera tradition has many opera plots that involve delog, and one of them, Nangsa Ubum, has a young woman in an unhappy marriage becoming a delog, and one of the side effects of her delog experiences and then her preaching, for lack of a better word, are that all of the injustices in her bad marriage and the kind of social injustices around her are eventually made right so that the opera ends in joy. And I'm wondering if this idea that delog preach is something that fits with what you've discovered, and also whether you've noticed any way in which delog set injustices right, either in their own lives or in the community.
Yeah, this is a great example of the way that the textual accounts differ from at least what I found in contemporary practice. I did not find that delog give teachings. I mean, they give these stories that definitely have an ethical dimension. I mean, they definitely kind of support Buddhist ideas about karma and rebirth. But the delog were not about to give any kind of teaching. And if the delog got the sense that I was wanting Buddhist teachings, or even if my questions got too theoretical, they would send me to the local monastery or send to go ask the lamas. I don't know anything about this. So in that sense, it was very different. In terms of righting wrongs and the person's life kind of all coming together once they become a delog, I didn't find that to be the case at all. As I said, the women describe it as a very difficult and physically exhausting, kind of painful thing that they have to do. And they're sometimes ostracized by their families, by their communities, because they're talking this weird stuff. So I think that's a place where the description that we get in the text, and like you mentioned in the opera story, is different from what's actually happening in real life.
That's very interesting. Well, that really connects to another question I had wanted very much to ask you about where exactly Delok fit within the world of Tibetan and Himalayan Buddhism. Are they Buddhist practitioners? Are they sometimes nuns or monks? You've just said that they don't, the ones that you met don't tend to give religious teachings, but where are they religious specialists? Where do they fit?
Well, in terms of being Buddhist, being practicing Buddhist, if they're not practicing Buddhist before the Daylok experience, they are after. And this is really unavoidable because devotion to the Buddhist three jewels and ethical living are qualities people look for when deciding whether or not a potential Daylok is genuine. So if you're not demonstrating these behaviors, you won't be recognized or respected as a Daylok. As far as being a monk or a nun, that's not necessary. No, that's really not necessary at all. I mean, some Daylok are monks and nuns, but just as many, I'd say, are lay people.
That's very interesting. Is there any kind of pattern, or are people willing to talk about what kinds of personal religious practices they do? Can we know anything about what kinds of personal religious practices Daylok do?
Well, they do standard devotional practices like prayer recitations. If they have the means, they hang prayer flags, sponsor tea ceremonies. They might call monks to their home to do blessing rituals. But I didn't run across any religious practices that were specific or unusual to Daylok.
That's interesting that you talk about that Daylok are expected to be very filled with devotion and faith to the Buddhist three jewels, to the Buddha, the teachings of the Buddha, and the community of practitioners, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. It's very interesting that Daylok are expected to be particularly full of devotion. I wonder if you could say more about that.
Um, really,
How
go ahead.
I was just going to sort of follow up to say how do they express their devotion, and why do people think that they should be devoted?
I suppose because, in a sense, the Daylok experience can function like as a conversion experience.
Aha.
For example, maybe someone isn't particularly religious beforehand. Maybe they have a reputation for having a very sharp tongue and getting angry. One thing that for others will prove that this person really did genuinely have a Daylok experience. They're not just faking. They're not just wanting attention. Is that their outlook and their behaviors have completely changed. Like, oh, this person is a different person. So it's something that's used to judge a person. Are they authentic or not? And they look at the amount of devotion that the Daylok displays.
That's so interesting, and I'm sure that's very interesting for our listeners because for many listeners, for example, in North America, Daylok practice and the idea of dying and returning from the dead, the idea that a really central part of Buddhist thought landscape for many Buddhists in the world involves parts of Buddhist cosmology that are really unfamiliar for Buddhists, often in North America. Here, we're talking about a situation in which Daylok are making claims about what really exists, what happens after death, and you're telling us that actually many people in their home communities, among Himalayan Buddhists, don't believe them, that there's a real question about whether people are faking, and that, in fact, some of the toughest critics are people's neighbors in their hometowns who say, you're just making this stuff up to make us look bad. So tell us more about the problem of being legitimate and about people's suspicion of Daylok.
Um, I think sometimes we have the idea that people that live in very rural communities that live very far away from us are somehow not skeptical. But that's not the case at all. And so there are lots of tests that a Daylok has to go through. But ultimately, to be accepted by a community and by the family, like what'll often end the family's abuse of the Daylok is to have the backing and the formal recognition of a respected lama, of an important teacher, a Buddhist teacher, whether monastic or not. And when that person, for whatever reason, decides that this person is legitimate, then the community is much more likely to accept him or her.
So, although delog are not necessarily monks or nuns, they're not necessarily slotted in a particular role into kind of Buddhist institutions. It sounds like a really key part of legitimating them is for a leading religious figure like a Buddhist Lama to authenticate them.
Absolutely. And so it's interesting that Daylok, like you mentioned earlier, people who are possessed and spirit mediums they kind of operate on the outside of monastic establishments. So you think of them as doing their own thing, but they're very heavily restrained in the things that they say, in the things that they do, by the fact that they need these usually monastic leaders to accept them and to tell everyone else that, yes, this is the real deal. So they have to stay in line with the official doctrines and official teachings.
That's so interesting. And are these dynamics new? Is delog practice new?
Daylok aren't new. You mentioned the opera of Nangsa Obum, and I think that I'm relying on Brian Cuevas here, but I think that dates to, or do you say the 12th century? And Cuevas, of course, questions whether or not Nangso was a historical person. But regardless, Tibetans cited her often as the original Daylok. So it's not a new tradition. In terms of the history, I don't know what it is. There's really nothing that's written about it. And, I tried asking people, ask really highly educated monks like Geshes and Khenpos, but nobody could tell me anything about it.
So there's a sense that people have been doing this for a long time, maybe even for 1,000 years. And it sounds like it's very deeply integrated into the fabric of people's day-to-day communal, devotional Buddhist activities in Himalayan communities. And yet, because it's outside the institutional framework of Buddhist monasteries and universities, it doesn't have a written history in the way that other kinds of philosophical or meditative systems might. That's very interesting. It's a kind of you're bringing light to an area that we're all fascinated by that we don't know much about. It's very exciting. Now, I have to ask you, just on a kind of personal level, what was it like for you to meet some of these delog, particularly some of these women who are delog? What can you say about that experience?
If I was trying to characterize what they're like, there's not much I can say. They were all very different. If there's any personality characteristic that they all shared, it's that they're excellent, with one exception, they are excellent storytellers. They have a talent for, say, conveying emotion and for really drawing you into their narratives.
That's very interesting. Was there any part of delog practice or of this research that surprised you or contradicted things you thought you knew?
Well, I was surprised at how variable the practice is. I expected it to be fairly standard, but I found that different regions of the Himalayas and different individuals have their very own individual understandings of Daylok and of their practices. In some places, Daylok are highly respected and they're venerated and treated like lamas, like very highly realized Buddhist practitioners. But in other communities, I found Daylok are looked at kind of in the way that Americans might look at psychics, as some kind of folk tradition for people who don't know any better.
That's very interesting. So there's a real range from veneration to quite profound skepticism. That's very interesting to hear. And in terms of the women that you met and men too who are delog, are they all still actively involved in the practice? Did you meet any people who had just become delog? What's the kind of status of this practice now?
Um, I had people tell me that it's dying, that it's a dying tradition, but likewise, before I met the first Daylok, I had plenty of people tell me that this practice is completely gone. It doesn't exist anymore. This only happened a long, long time ago. Um, so I don't think that it's in any danger of disappearing. Um, I met I met young people, I met old people, people who had lost the respect of their community and who had been considered very good, very reliable delog, but who weren't anymore. So it was all over the board.
That's very interesting. So it's and that doesn't surprise me somehow. We live in a time of flux, and so you could say similar things about many practices. Well, before we close, I just wanted to invite you if there's anything about the way you understand religion or religious practice kind of more globally that's shifted as a result of doing this research. Did it change your sense of the landscape of religious practice or some of the ideas you might have had previously?
It's only now that I teach an undergrad course called Introduction to Religion that I've taken the time to think about the category of religion. My interest in religious studies and in Buddhism really grew out of experiences in the field, you could say. So instead of starting with texts, I started with people. And so this research kind of it confirmed my earlier observations that religious practice is highly variable and individualistic, and that explanations people give often don't match official doctrine. And that's in the cases where people have explanations. I'm always looking for explanations and looking for reasons, and oftentimes I'm the only one who cares, right? I mean, the why isn't always important to the people involved. So in that sense, I suppose it was another lesson in, you can't necessarily match what the book says to what people actually think and what people actually do.
That's great. Well, that's a very exciting note on which to end. I think we've given our listeners a lot of food for thought, both about what is involved in dying, what other realms of experience people describe in certain settings, and also it's very fruitful to reflect on your remarks about the world of religious practice and the way that we could start with people rather than books. We might get a quite different picture of what's involved. So I want to thank you so much for talking with me today. It's been a real pleasure.
It was great, Annabella. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. I learned a lot. Take care.
Good night.